To apprise our viewers on how political parties have galvanized under one umbrella in protest of the treatment meted out to this diplomat, a news that we are just getting in at this point of time. The Shiv Sena is holding protest at the U.S Embassy. That's the latest. These visuals we are beaming to you live of the Shiv Sena in the national capital, the Shiv Sena cadre outside the U.S Embassy holding protest. Well, this is not the first political party, but just a short while back we'd also seen Delhi University students doing the same. So clearly all political parties coming under one umbrella in protest of the behavior that Devyani Khobragade was subjected to. And Jaskirat Singh Bawa is with us, talking us through these visuals now. Jaskirat, clearly, this is not the first protest that has taken place, but the Shiv Sena right now lodging a protest outside the U.S Embassy. Can you talk us through these visuals, please?
Well, the group which is actually outside the U.S Embassy is a group of Delhi University students, notably from the ABVP group, which is what they claim to be. There were about 10 or 20 of them. Before that, another fringe element group, political group, which has actually made its presence felt at almost all embassies whenever India's had an international problem, whether it be in the Italian Marines case or the border incursion with China. They came in earlier in the day. The Rashtravaadi Shiv Sena, which are the protests, the visual that we just saw a while back on here, they were stopped a good 2 kilometers before the embassy compound. The Delhi police team intervened and they actually intercepted them, and about 15 or 20 of them were there. They were all rounded up and taken up to the police station, and after that they all, of course, dispersed. What we've seen is we have actually seen 3 different groups turn up near or at the U.S Embassy today, protesting the treatment meted out to the Indian diplomat in U.S. Almost all of them have been dispersed from the U.S Embassy compound also, but there is still a paramilitary CRPF post, plus Delhi police force, plus the U.S Embassy's own personal security guard completely lined up outside the embassy compound, anticipating any other protesters who may be trying to get in.
All right, Jaskirat, do stay on with us once again. These visuals are being beamed for our viewers right outside the U.S Embassy. You could see the Shiv Sena cadre there lodging a political protest. Well, one thing that has happened at this point of time is, and we saw that on the floor of the parliament, that all parties have come together in one voice, unilaterally protesting the treatment meted out to the country's diplomat in the United States of America. Atir Khan, who was in the parliament, is still with us. Atir, you know, right now we are showing the protests that are waging outside the U.S Embassy by Shiv Sena. But this one instance, Atir, strangely so, has brought all political parties under one umbrella unilaterally together, protesting the treatment meted out to Devyani Khobragade.
Well, that's right. You know, it's not for the first time this has happened, though this has been quite embarrassing, you know, the kind of treatment which has been given to a senior diplomat. So clearly, it has been brewing for a long time now. In the past also, renowned and respectable Indians have been humiliated by the U.S. authorities. We have the case of George Fernandez, the former Indian president. We know of UP Chief Minister and his minister who was also humiliated. So there are a number of cases in which, you know, this has been seen. So therefore, there is a feeling among the political parties that it's enough.
Okay.
And the government, it's high time that government should do something about it.
All right, you know, stay with us, Atir. I'd like to also bring in Jaskirat, who's standing outside the U.S Embassy. He's been tracking all the protests that have been taking place there through the course of the day. Jaskirat, talk us through this, because of course earlier on there were concerns raised by the U.S. on security issues which were completely put to rest by the Ministry of External Affairs in India. Right now, what is the situation there?
Well, just to give our viewers a complete understanding about the change in the security situation at the U.S Embassy, what has changed was the courtesy was extended to the U.S Embassy up till yesterday evening, where concrete barricades or barriers were actually put on the main public road or service lanes around the U.S Embassy compound, which would have slowed any of the oncoming traffic which could have been coming from any of the sites. There is also a service road, a public use road, which is dividing a U.S Embassy compound with another U.S Embassy related residential official compound. So the people from the compounds who were walking across the road, that's also where the barriers were put. Now these were removed. As far as the actual security of the U.S Embassy is concerned, there's been no change in that. The perimeter security is handled by a private security agency hired by the U.S Embassy, so that's perfectly intact. The paramilitary forces are also deployed, not just for the protesters, but also for any untoward incident that may take place. But that's also because of the responsibility of India to ensure that no untoward incident takes place. The change that has come in, and which was a visible change, was the removal of those traffic barriers, which slowed down the traffic initially to allow for some check-in of the vehicles.
All right, appreciate you joining us, Jaskira. Do stay on with us. Atir Khan getting us the latest from the Parliament as well. We'll keep coming back to you. But let's bring our viewers details of that email written by Devyani to her IFS colleagues recounting the ordeal she had to go through after being arrested that spurred India into action.
I'm so grateful for all the outpouring of unequivocal support and backing that has been available to me from the fraternity. I take comfort in the confidence that this invaluable support will also be translated into strong and swift action to ensure the safety of me and my children, as also to preserve the dignity of our service, which is unquestionably under siege. While I was going through it, although I must admit that I broke down many times as the indignities of repeated handcuffing, stripping and cavity searches, swabbing in a hold-up with common criminals and drug addicts were all being imposed upon me despite my incessant assertions of immunity. I got the strength to regain composure and remain dignified, thinking that I must represent all of my colleagues and my country with confidence and pride.
As Indian diplomat Devyani Khobragade's plight hit headlines back here in India, the U.S. media has been also following Devyani's arrest and following diplomatic war very closely. Our strategic affairs editor, Gaurav Sawant, now joins me with some reactions from the U.S. media.
The US media has covered the Devyani Khobragade arrest and its impact story prominently. The New York Times says the way an Indian diplomat was treated by law enforcement officials in New York last week has touched off a furor in India, where politicians from across the political spectrum expressed outrage, and the New Delhi police retaliated by removing security barriers that were meant to protect the American embassy. Let's now get you the Washington Post reaction. The Washington Post is far more aggressive. It says the Indian government, furious about the rough treatment of a woman diplomat arrested in New York, moved to sharply rein in privileges of US diplomats working in India, escalating a rare dispute between two normally friendly nations. As a final slap, Indian authorities removed concrete security barricades from outside the US Embassy complex in New Delhi. The Hill, however, is even more direct in its report, as it writes, authorities in India removed security barriers in front of the US Embassy in New Delhi on Tuesday as an act of revenge after the arrest of an Indian diplomat in New York last week.
Well, thank you, Gaurav. My colleague right now, Rishika Barua, caught up with Amy Casman of the Financial Times to know how the United States, the media of the United States, is reacting to this news.
As the diplomatic row between India and the United States escalates, to put some perspective into this issue, I have with me Amy Casman from the Financial Times. Amy, not very good times, diplomatically, India and US at the brink of a huge standoff. How do you see this panning out?
I think this is all very, very unfortunate. U.S.-India relations had already been losing momentum since the kind of headiness of the post-civil nuclear deal environment. And I think it's a real shame that this incident, which raises larger questions, has become so heated and emotional. There are obviously important issues that need to be sorted out between India and the U.S. on some of these questions, like Indian diplomats bringing Indian staff, domestic staff with them on assignment to the U.S., how this diplomat was treated, whether it was a violation of the Vienna Convention. I think these are issues that need to be negotiated carefully at the highest level, and I think it's sad that it seems to have become incredibly emotional and people are just making this out into being an issue of national pride.
Well, it seems like, the Indian politicians, the Indian Parliament has taken it upon itself to sort this matter out, has decided to take a very tough stance on the issue. How do you think this is going to, do you think this is going to escalate? How do you see this turning out in the next couple of days?
I don't know exactly how this will play out. One can only hope that calm will return and cooler counsel will prevail, and that, you know, there will be able to be some kind of negotiations to resolve this. But I do think it does highlight an important kind of cultural clash between two very big democracies, but that still have very different priorities in some aspects. I think in the U.S. there's a very high priority on the rule of law, no matter who you are and how big you are. The rule of law applies to you, whereas I think that in India there is a kind of a culture where people in positions of power expect to be able to be treated in certain ways, even with such phenomenon as anticipatory bail. So I think there's a clash that way, and at the same time there's a real clash, obviously, on labor and treatment of labor and what's considered a fair and decent treatment of labor. This issue of how Indian diplomats are treating their domestic staff while on assignment in the U.S. has been a recurring issue for the Indian government. And I would think that really one should think about how perhaps best to avoid these kinds of issues from happening in the future. We all have to be respectful of each other's cultural sensitivities, and I think maybe there needs to be some sensitivity of how these are perceived and play out in America when you have domestic staff getting paid at certain levels and being treated in a certain way that perhaps here would be considered more acceptable.
Amy, you're an American journalist living in New Delhi. We saw yesterday that the security checkposts from the American Embassy were removed. Do you fear, some kind of a backlash here back in India?
I certainly hope not. I'm not expecting it. As I said, I'm hoping that cooler heads will prevail. I think there are important issues that this case has apparently highlighted in the relationship between the U.S. and India. These are two great democracies. They should have, strong relations in the long run. And it would be sad to see this kind of incidents blow up out of proportion. And I will hope that it does get resolved appropriately.
Well, attributing it to cultural difference and hoping that this issue, in fact, does get resolved peacefully and cooler calm prevails between the United States and India. That was Amy Kasman talking to us from the Financial Times. With camera person Ankur, this is Rishika Barua in New Delhi for Headlines Today.